Well, good morning once again and welcome to the booth as we continue to look through our series in Romans chapter 1. We are finally moving out of the introductory passages of Romans. Maybe you feel like we've been stuck there for a while, maybe you've enjoyed it, hopefully you have, but we're going to be looking starting with verse 18 in chapter 1 this morning at the next section of the book of Romans as Paul just dives straight into some deep and heavy theology. And so I hope you're looking forward to it. You see, it took us a while to get through the beginning of the book of Romans because there is so much in this passage. Like there's just so much going on. And a lot of it sets up the people of Rome to be in a good place to hear what Paul is going to say in verse 18. And so he introduces the book. He says, look, this is who I am. I'm an apostle. We have a mutual call to apostleship. This is who Jesus is. Also, here is the purpose of the mission, which is to build the kingdom in Jesus' name and for his sake, not for our sake. And how much I want to go to Rome and to preach there and to teach you all and to share with you. We looked very briefly last week at why we gather together as Christians and the mutual benefit that has to the body of Christ. And then finally he gets to the point where he's like, look, I have to come, I have to preach to the Gentiles and to the Greeks and to anybody else who will hear it. That's why I haven't made it there yet. And here is the theme of what we're going to be discussing. It is the righteousness of God and the righteousness that he imparts to us. That is, in a nutshell, the first 17 verses of Romans. And it is so crucial to have some understanding of that before diving into verse 18. Because we're going to jump in here and it gets deep fast. Verse 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people, who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. Oof. I mean, this is like, hey, Jesus, I love you guys. I want to come and preach to you. We're going to talk about righteousness, but in order to talk about righteousness, we have to talk about the wrath of God. Now, this can be a very tricky subject to explore. A lot of Christians don't acknowledge a wrath of God or a wrathful God. In fact, so much of what the church has done over the last 100 years is develop a loving, giving God. That's all he does is give for our sake. But that's not the God that we see in the Bible. That's not the God that Paul is bringing to Rome or explaining to Rome. And he just dives like head into this. It reminds me, my brother and I watched a show in our teenage years called Top Gear. It's a car show. It's kind of all over the world. There's a US one. I think there's like a German one. But it started in the UK. And it's these three guys and they go on wacky adventures with cars. You don't have to like cars or to be a motorhead to really enjoy it, or a gearhead or whatever it's called. I'm not. I enjoy cars, but I don't follow them that much. And so they go and they end up in the Arctic Circle, I think in Russia somewhere, and they are in a plow or somewhere in that part of the world. And they're trying to plow this road across this like snow polar tundra. And at one point they're looking out at the road ahead of them and they're not really sure like what they're going to do, like how they're going to manage plowing this. And the main guy says like, well, how deep can the snow be? And he decides to test it by tucking his arms in and jumping into the ice head first. And he kind of conks his head on the snow because it's quite tough. And it's rather amusing, not a great way to measure snow for a myriad of reasons. But this is what Paul is doing to the Romans. He says, look guys, this is snow. It's white, it's cold, it melts, it has these characteristics. I'm here to explain it to you, but it's pure. And yeah, we're going to jump in and I'm going to tell you all about it. Head first into a snowbank. It might be a bit of a stretch of an analogy, but it was an amusing episode. So he jumps in and he says, look, there is a wrath of God. First and foremost, this passage is reminding the Romans that there is a wrath of God. And moreover, that we all deserve to feel the effect and to be attacked by that wrath. Attacked might not be the correct word, but we all deserve, as fallen humans, to receive the wrath of God. And one of the reasons that we deserve it, and to make it, we'll explore in a minute, there's actually several reasons, but we'll dive into what the other part of this is talking about, where it's talking about being made known by God. But first and foremost, talking about the wrath of God, like I said, it's tricky, and Christians can have a hard time reconciling a loving God with a wrathful God. I would say that especially Christians who were introduced to God as children, young adult Christians who are trying to figure out life and really need like an A plus B equals C type formula and things to work out nicely. And I would say if you're young in your faith even at this point, like there are so many parts of our life that would make this tricky. But it doesn't need to be. And the reason it's difficult is we just don't talk about it enough. But there is a wrath of God that we need to discuss. So how do you reconcile a loving God with a wrathful God? Well, first off, you have to know a bit about the character of God. What at its core essence is God? And we have talked about this. We looked at this in our doctrine study on the Trinity. We looked at this when we talked about who God is in our Back to Basics series. And now we're looking at it because we have built off of that and we need to see the attributes that come from that. So at its core essence, the wrath of God is an attribute of the core essence of God. I said that backwards. The wrath of God is an attribute of the core essence of who God is. Which is to say, when you look at God's most base fundamental nature, which is expressed to us and shown to us as love, you have to find a place in there to come to the realization that where there is a true, good, just, godly love, there must be a presence of wrath, or the component of wrath has the potential to exist. And I'll explain that hopefully a little bit better here. So put yourself in the shoes of a parent for a moment. Right? Maybe you are a parent, maybe you're a guardian of some sort, maybe you don't have kids, doesn't matter. Put yourself in their shoes and imagine you have a child who is arrested and goes to jail for something that they're going to be in jail for a few years for, drug possession or something like that. I know that drug possession is not anything but a misdemeanor in Oklahoma, but regardless, we'll just pretend, okay? So they go to jail and you as a parent have a decision to make. Can I bail them out? Like I love them, I care for them, I want to help them, and it seems to me that being in jail isn't the best, so I'm gonna bail them out. So you put together some money and you find a way to bail your kid out of jail. 3 months later, the child does the exact same thing, ends up back in jail. And now you have to make a decision again. Do I bail them out again, or do I let them suffer the consequences of their own action? One is more loving, I believe, than the other, and that is letting them suffer the consequence of their actions. You see, loving somebody and true love is doing what is best for someone, regardless of whether they want it or not. Right? They may not even deserve it, but it's doing what is best for someone. And in that instance, it may be best for that child to feel the consequences of his action and to go through the prison system. Maybe not, but they have to make that decision. Where there is true love, you also have to be subject to the consequences of your own action. Loving is not just giving and fixing and repairing and building up where you've broken down. Love is providing and it's also removing. It's giving and taking away. It is allowing us to feel the consequences of our own actions. And so Paul says, first and foremost, there is a wrath of God, and it has been revealed to us. I believe if you read the Old Testament, you'll see it, and we'll talk about an instance in a second. But moreover, that it is an act of the love of God. It is from who God is that the wrath of God even exists. Because at his base essence, he is love. And so from that, there is an attribute of wrath that must exist. But one of the reasons I think it typically is hard to reconcile is when we think of wrath, we think of a more human kind of wrath, where it comes from a place of anger or revenge, or a desire for revenge, excuse me. But that's not what this is. The wrath of God comes solely out of his love for us. He has given us free will out of love, and he loves us so much, he refuses to take it away. And unfortunately, that means that we have to suffer the consequences of our poor decisions, or at least be exposed to that wrath. You see, we'll go through later and we'll talk about how while we are vulnerable to it, we are no longer really subjected to it because we have been saved by Christ. But Paul, before jumping into the wrath of God, that connects us to a good point, talks about being saved and receiving salvation. If you were to scroll back a little bit to verse 16, Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. So whether you understand why God has wrath, or whether you understand where it comes from, or the character of God in that sense, you could argue that there is a wrath of God without knowing all that, simply by the fact that there is salvation by God. If God is offering us salvation, if we receive salvation through Jesus, what are we being saved from? There is a judgment, a subjection to the consequences of our actions. If there is nothing to be saved from, why do we talk about salvation at all? There has to be something. And so just based on the fact that we go through a process of salvation, of being justified and being made righteous, there must be something to be saved from. And Paul says that not only is there something to be saved from, but the wrath that is a result, or the wrath that comes from our wickedness, which is what we're saved from, has been made evident to everyone by the nature of God. And so maybe you don't understand where it comes from. You're still struggling to reconcile love and wrath in one character. But I can tell you this, there is no excuse for not seeking salvation with Jesus. Because just in the character of who God is, and his eternality and his creativeness and his who he is as a creator God from the beginning, you can see his presence in nature. And Paul makes it clear there's no excuse for people to not follow him. But before we get there, I'm reminded of the Israelites in Exodus. Exodus 32 is where the Israelites are down at the base of the mountain. Moses is up on the mountain, and they go to Aaron and say, look, this guy Moses, we don't know what happened to him. He could be dead or alive. Like, we want to worship something, which is a weird impulse, by the way, is it not? If you are not worshiping God, where does this impulse come from? We'll talk about that another day. But they say, look, make us an idol to worship. So Aaron says, all right, bring me your earrings and your jewelry and I'll make an idol. And he does. Well, this is problematic for obviously many reasons, not the least of which is that 12 chapters earlier, which was not a huge amount of time between these two passages, they're given the 10 commandments, one of which is not to worship idols. Beyond that, they have made a covenant to follow God, which includes following his law. And outside of the 10 commandments, there is further instruction before this event to be careful not to follow idols or to worship idols. They're just at their infancy and they've already lost this faith. And people may say, like, they were still learning, maybe. No, God says there's no excuse. And this is what Paul says as he continues in verse 21. For since, in verse 20, the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Guess what? Whether or not you have been to church, grew up in a Christian home, ever had an evangelical experience with another Christian, God says, look around you. Look at my creation. Look at the mountains and the stars. Just observe the world. You can see the presence of God in it. And no man has an excuse to not follow God. But still, time and time again, Paul goes on to say, people neither worshiped God nor gave thanks to him. They forsook him and they trampled him down and they started to worship other gods. And so God released them to their wicked ways, essentially. We'll go a bit more detail later, or next week, sorry. But it is a really fascinating thing. It is a part of nature, really, that helps us understand. It's just the fact that beauty exists in nature that helps us understand that there is a wrath of God. that there is this God in the world, and therefore a loving God and a creator God has to be a loving God, and there must be wrath. And that may sound like a bit of a leap. Please come talk to me or reach out to us if it is, because I can work through how that process works and how to get there. So when the Israelites start worshiping an idol, we're told that God is furious. And God says to Moses, after this huge infraction, leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and I may destroy them, and I will make you, Moses, into a great nation. Of course, if you don't know what happened next, I encourage you to go read Exodus 32. It's a fascinating story, and the rest of your Bible while you're at it. But read that chapter, because how the wrath of God is diverted there is amazing. But he is ready to expose the people of Israel who have broken a covenant and are justly deserving of punishment. He is ready to expose them to the wrath of God. And I don't say all this so that we begin to fear God, but rather that we have a greater appreciation for the love and the forgiveness and the mercy of God, and continue to have an awe of God. That fear and awe, the understanding that this incredibly powerful creator God deserves to seek vengeance for the sins against him on the world from his creation, but rather sets that aside and sacrifices his own son so that we are not subject to that wrath anymore and that we can live with him. Let's not waste this opportunity. Let's be careful with what we do and what we say, and work out the mission that Paul explains at the beginning of Romans. But unfortunately, I feel like we are in a world now where we're not going out and asking people to make idols for us. They sort of surreptitiously come to us and become part of our life. So many things that exist today are idolatrous for the modern Christian. Think of, we're going through this pandemic and everything, and just think of the reaction that some of the world had when they found out that athletics were canceled, or at least you couldn't go see them live. I still remember the impact that many, many years ago when we were living in Canada, the hockey lockout had on people and on television. I didn't even watch hockey. Like it affected all of us just by the ripple effect of it, and the writers' strike back many years ago as well. These things have become idols to us. They now are more important to us. They come between us and God and have therefore become idols. We're not going out and asking somebody to make a golden calf. That's too obvious. But we are exposed to the wrath of God, and we do deserve the wrath of God. It does exist. It is completely okay for a loving God to have a characteristic, to have an attribute of wrath. In fact, it is a necessity. And I hope that we live out in deep appreciation and respect for the fact that we are not subject to that wrath when we have Jesus in our life. So, I do encourage all of you, don't waste your time, because there's nothing in this world, there's nobody in this world that is going to go to heaven because they weren't ministered to. Everyone has seen God in this world. Everyone will see God in this world. We are the only thing between them and hell. We have to help them find Jesus because it makes sense for them to go to hell. This is the system that God has been subject to since man sinned. That was a strange sentence. But I do encourage you to not waste our time. Let's make sure that we are building the kingdom for Jesus' sake, not for ours or for our family or for our friends, but making sure that we know there is a wrath that the world is subject to, and we know that we have been saved and freed from it And we need to share that and bring it to the world around us. And so as you go about your week, I would encourage you to spend some time dwelling on the things that God has saved us from. Not dwelling on them and falling into like a pit of despair, but on the miracles that have happened in our life, that we have been saved from the wrath of God. Read through the Old Testament and you will see time and time again that he subjects and he releases the Israelites to the wrath of God from their own actions. And be in prayer and praise and worship. I would say that the suitable response to being freed from the wrath of God is only worship. And so when we get together on Sunday and we work through what you're watching right now, we're going to be singing about worship, we're going to be worshiping, and we're going to be enjoying the splendor of God. Take some time this week to enjoy the grandeur of your Maker, because it is in that we see the character of God that we will be rejoined to, and it's where we see what we have been saved from. So, we're going to continue to work through Romans next week in the booth. But for now, you can be saved from the wrath of God. And I pray now that you seek the salvation and the mercy of Jesus. Find the cross, find him at his feet, and leave behind all those things that keep us subjected to the wrath of God, and take up freedom in his Son.